This is Creative Banter, a creativity and philosophy-focused podcast hosted by Cody Schultz and Ben Horn. While many photographers think of pairing their photographs on the facing pages of a monograph or perhaps the pairings that naturally occur when working on a large project, pairing photographs to go together as prints can be quite challenging. As we discuss the photographs Ben revealed from his 2022 fall trip to Zion National Park, we discuss the potential that some of these pieces have, especially when put aside past works. When speaking on a photograph he had taken of a Utah Serviceberry, the conversation shifts towards predictability and how we find ourselves in a rhythm, understanding what works best at various points of the day for various subjects. A bit outside of the photographic realm, Ben brings up a recent survey done by the Washington Post, which looks at the happiest jobs on Earth, ranking them by means of stress, meaning, and general happiness. This leads to our ending the discussion with numerous facts about the woodland, all taken from a wonderful book, and how much of this knowledge was already known, though we were not conscious of it. Let's dive right into this, shall we?
All right, I'm rolling on my end.
So I heard back from Hugo with Chamonix regarding the focus creep on the camera.
Yeah, so what's the deal with that? I'm curious what he has to say about that.
So if you're looking at the back of the camera, just inside the actual bed of it, right by the focus knob, there's a little a hex screw that you can use like an Allen wrench for, and that will tighten up the focusing rod, the focusing mechanism.
So is it just adding a bit more base tension to it, or is it like using that as a lock?
Just adding more base tension to it.
Okay,
so
that's really good to know.
Yeah, so it's not as nice of a fix as implementing a locking mechanism like what yours has.
Yeah.
And I haven't been able to play around with it. I just tightened it up a little bit, and
yeah,
I'm going to be going out tomorrow to meet up with one of our listeners, actually. Go for a hike and just talk and whatever.
Very cool.
Yeah, so I'll experiment more with it then, see if that fixes it and what the deal is there. Like I said, it's not something that I really would have to worry about a lot because of how I photograph typically, but
yeah, still
it's nice. I figured out what size Allen wrench I need, threw that in my camera bag with the Allen wrench that I use for my tripod and everything else, and yeah, so now it's there.
That's good. I'll have to look on my camera too to see if it has that, because I feel like the focus is could use a little bit more base resistance. So if I happen to have that on mine as well,
I can't imagine that you wouldn't.
Nice to fine tune. Yeah, it's kind of like I can see how it'd be just a universal part of the design of all of them. So yeah, that's cool that you reached out to him, and I'm sure that there are some people listening to this right now who are just throwing it on pause at the moment and pulling out the cameras like, oh, okay, that's where it is. Okay, cool. And everyone else is like, yeah, I it's, you know.
Yeah. My lens doesn't have that.
Yes, yeah.
That's cool. It's weird though, because speaking on like that aspect of it, we're recording this on Tuesday before the episode we had spoken of this has even come out. So yeah. Unless you're like one of the 2 higher tiers on Patreon where you have early access, you have no idea what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's just weird to think about, but
yeah.
In other words too, I finally caught up and finished with all of your videos from Zion from last year.
Very cool.
Yeah, I got some couple thoughts there, especially with the film reveal. Specifically, just 3 photographs that I thought were quite interesting to look at, and I'm not quite sure how you feel now after it's been a little while regarding them, but
yeah,
you had the Serviceberry, I think is what you had called it.
Yeah, Utah Serviceberry. Yeah.
Yeah, the cactus with the crack,
Yeah.
and the what I would consider like waves kind of photograph that you have.
Yeah, was that the one with the
Yeah,
wet mud? Yeah.
yeah, kind of looked like wave ripple kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, especially the cactus crack was
Mm-hmm.
I thought was really nice, really nicely done,
Thanks.
and would make for, I think, a good pairing to your photo, Southwestern Zen.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I can see how there's some similarities there.
Yeah, because in Southwestern Zen, you kind of have that, what is it, like sagebrush up
Yeah.
against the canyon wall. And kind of similar enough composition that I think it would make a nice little pairing. Because that's something that I want to get more into as well, the pairing photographs.
Yeah, it is fascinating to pair the images, and you never really know how they'll pair until you see them right next to each other. But yeah, I had not even gotten to the point of thinking about pairing any of those images, so that's actually pretty fascinating to hear.
Regarding those photos, has your perception on them changed at all since that film reveal?
A little bit. So the photo of the wet mud, I still have kind of a love-hate relationship with that one. I've tried all kinds of things with that one after scanning it. To me, I can't get the sense of calm in that image that I would like to. And I think it's because the background's a little bit brighter than the foreground because of just the way it's reflecting light. But it kind of leads my eye astray. And when I've tried to resolve that, I'm not quite happy with it. But the exposure is good and technically it's good. So that one I still have very mixed thoughts on. The Utah Serviceberry, just the composition I'm still not happy with. Everything else is technically fine on it. But there's this one dominant branch that I just don't like. It steals the show in kind of a weird way. And then the photo with the fractured sandstone with the cactus. So I exposed 4 sheets of film on that, 3 of which were the problematic batch of expired film. And then there was one of them which I discovered while I was working on a ebook with the journal entries and all that sort of stuff from that trip. And I've discovered that one's actually on a good batch of film.
Interesting.
And so I may need to revisit that one. I still feel like my exposure is probably a little bit dark on it. And if possible, I'd like to reshoot it. But it's a little bit of a tricky scene because there's some really dark areas and some really bright areas. So I think I need to revisit that one. I love the composition. Technically, it's about as well polished as it can be. The lower left foreground is very blurry, but it's fine. But I feel like it's most of the way there. But I do like the composition. So I'm curious what your thoughts and why you had mentioned those 3 in particular.
The cactus one was immediately I thought of the Southwestern Zen, and just that pairing, how the similarities between them and how nice they would look side by side, kind of thing. So that's really what drew me to that. Plus, I don't really see you photograph a lot of that kind of thing.
Like with the cactus or?
Yeah, with the cactus specifically.
Yeah.
A lot of it is more like the typical like mud cracks, the trees and that kind of thing. Not so much the more intimate plants and vegetation.
Yeah.
So I
Which
thought
is very true.
Yeah. So I thought that was a little bit different, something to add to your portfolio more uniquely kind of deal.
Yeah.
And kind of this in a similar vein, the Serviceberry one, just because it was very. It's not necessarily a unique viewpoint, I don't think. It's been done before. I've seen others do it, definitely. Yeah. But again, from you, not so much. And seeing your take on it, I think is interesting to see. Which I think goes with anything, like, and a reason why not to shy away from doing what's already been done because you're always going to add a little something to it regardless.
And there was someone, I believe, in I think it may have been in the comments on YouTube, but I think someone has suggested like a square crop of that one, which I hadn't really considered, but I'll have to kind of play with that and see if that resolves anything. But I think also on that particular trip, it was similar to in 2021, where I got into a decent rhythm, and I wasn't really expecting anything tremendously from any of the images. It was like just finding something, throwing a composition on it, exposing the film, moving on to the next. And it was a very relaxed way of working, which I did enjoy, which is completely different than on the trip in 2020. And then also on the previous trips when I was, had that looming deadline ahead of, I'm going to be doing this, making a living off this pretty soon. So I think it's also that I kind of settled into a bit more of a rhythm where I've built more trust in knowing what will work pretty well for a photo and just kind of going along with it.
So in that vein, through this year and these new upcoming trips, are you trying to stay away from being so, I hate to say it, but predictable?
Yeah.
Or are you planning on experimenting a little bit more here and there, like with your the Serviceberry and perhaps the Waves photograph?
I don't know that there's because I mean, in some of the predictability is really a matter of knowing what sort of subjects work well, what kind of compositions work well, and kind of knowing what I want from a subject. But at the same time, while remaining fairly open to other things as well. And it's actually interesting that you mentioned the fact that, I don't really have any other cactus photos. And I think there's a fair amount of cactus like that in Zion, but it's typically growing on kind of like sandy hills it's more out in the open where it gets a lot of sunlight.
Right.
And so it sees a lot of harsh light and usually isn't very well positioned against an attractive background. And so that particular cactus just happened to be in a narrow canyon against a really nice wall, which is not as common to come by. So I think that's why I spotted that one. But also another thing too, in my quest of learning more about the plants and animals and such in Zion and the other places I photograph, I learned something interesting about that type of cactus. So those cactus pads, when they break off from the cactus, they can just like lay down on the side. They can grow roots down into the soil, which was really kind of a fascinating learning process while I was kind of spent some time with that cactus, because there was another one nearby that was kind of starting to drop roots. So I think it's also part of the ever-evolving curiosity about these areas kind of pulling me in different directions too.
Yeah, I think I actually have one of those cactus sitting in my room here, or at least very similar looking cactus.
Yeah, these ones, it's weird because they'll go kind of purplish.
Okay.
So I have no clue what species it is. I still need to look that one up.
Yeah, but
they are really fascinating plants.
The one that I have is such a pain to repot. I did it the other day, and because they're flat, they don't look like they have like the sharp bristles and all that.
But they got little ones on there.
Yeah, they have those real thin ones that are real annoying. So you just touch it to move it a little bit, and you have like 17 of them in your fingers, and they never want to come out either.
Oh, jeez,
so, yeah. But speaking on like the predictability and everything, that's something that I want to work on this year too. And I've been waiting.
Becoming more or less predictable?
Less predictable.
Less predictable.
At least a little bit. I've been waiting, but it's so tough because like right now it's like 45 degrees. It's 41 degrees outside right now and overcast. So I want to work more with ice photos. and little frozen fractures in the ice and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Can't really do that when there's no ice because it's too warm.
Yes.
It makes it a little difficult.
Yeah.
Because when I had the digital camera around this time last year, I had taken a couple photographs of the ice, and it almost made it look kind of like universal, like you were looking up at the sky in different universes and galaxies and that kind of deal.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'd love to do a little project on that with the 4x5, just because you could get so much more detail and really have a bit of fun with it.
Yeah.
But I'm waiting on the ice.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a great subject to work with. Definitely something I very much enjoy finding when I'm in Zion, and especially there are some areas where you'll see a pool of water there, and then you look at the forecast and like, all right, it's going to be 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, so you can go back to that pool in the morning. It's going to be frozen over. So you never quite know how it's going to look until you see it in those conditions, and it changes so much from day to day.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty cool subject, and also it's one I haven't seen a lot of people work with black and white. It seems like all the ice patterns and textures and stuff, it's a lot of that's in color. So I do look forward to when you do get that really cold temperature, how that will look in black and white.
yeah, you can go really, really dark with it too, which is fun because
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about having any kind of detail underneath the ice because there's nothing really to see that's of any visual interest down there.
Yeah.
So you can really make it look like all of the little white specks in the ice, all of the little bubbles and everything are, like I had said, about like stars and different planets and that kind of deal. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it if we ever get down to those kind of temperatures, because like I said, we're sitting at about 40 degrees now, and
Yeah.
even though it gets down to 24 or so at night, it's not enough to freeze most of the little ponds that are around us.
Yeah.
So
And also that sort of subject works really well for large format, just because you can move that plane of focus around and get it all, technically solid, which is nice. So it's just another little added benefit there as well.
yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to ask with your Utah trips and everything,
Mm-hmm.
how do you not get so overwhelmed by all the beauty that's there?
I think it's a matter of developing a sort of tunnel vision. And I think that comes with time and with experience. Because I still remember the first time that I drove through Zion National Park. I was like white knuckling the steering wheel with my basically my chin perched kind of like on top of the steering wheel as I'm kind of like looking out the front window and looking at all the cliffs around me. And it was a matter of pure visual sensory overload to the point where it was beautiful. And I'm like, there's no way that a person can do this place any sort of justice in terms of trying to capture it as it is. But now I don't have quite that same experience. I admire the beauty of the place. It's absolutely beautiful, but I don't have that same degree of sensory overload to my surroundings, from the standpoint that I have more of a narrow focus on some of these smaller details. And based on going back there again and again, you learn to pick up these smaller details, these smaller changes, and they grab your attention. So you just like, you focus on those small things as opposed to the greater scene around you. And this isn't to say that I don't admire the greater scenes. There's times I'll just sit there and just, without the camera, especially, to sit there and just, take some time to relax and just, take in the sights and sounds around me. But I think it's something that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of experience with a location in order to develop that eye for the details. And so I think, just like we were talking about in some past episodes, it's something that comes with time. And, if a person were to just say, I'm going to go on a trip to Zion and I'm going to produce some, portfolio type work, good luck. It takes a lot more than that, because you have to build a relationship with the place. So I think it's because of that relationship that not only am I able to find these sort of subjects I'm very satisfied with, but also I can walk away from them after having photographed them feeling confident with the work that I did, and not be constantly pulled in every other direction by everything else I see, heading back to my truck or whatever. So it comes with time, I think, is what it boils down to.
Yeah. I mean, I saw that going to Acadia for the first time and exposing 43 sheets of film and only coming away with 2, maybe 3 portfolio grade shots.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the only thing that saved me from that when it came to the Smokies was just because it was an environment that I wasn't familiar with. I wasn't unfamiliar with it, just because I'm so used to the woods and it's more my terrain. Whereas Acadia, it's a lot different in a little bit of a way. But that's certainly something when I go to Acadia, I want to be more mindful of. I want to actually go out and try maybe a different approach to photography, to go on a hike a couple days a week without the camera.
Yes, I was just going to suggest that, because I find that to be very beneficial, because it forces you to see things differently. And if you do find something that you otherwise may have set up the camera and photograph, you can't do that. So you move along and you find something else, and you end up finding all these great things, whether it's you're noticing a particular texture somewhere or the way that the light strikes something. But it's a matter of just building all of that into this catalog in your mind, which I think allows us to not only find subjects right then and there to perhaps return to at some point, but also just, I think it fine-tunes the process of what to look for and what truly feels special, as opposed to, that looks good, I'm going to take a picture of it right now.
Yeah, because you don't get that same level of connection when you're doing that kind of thing. When you're just constantly photographing, going from one thing, you turn around and you photograph the next.
Yeah.
And that was definitely a trap that I got sucked into. Something definitely that I want to try and avoid when I go up there again, but we'll see how well that actually works.
Yeah. And kind of on the topic of the outdoors and stuff along those lines, just before we started recording, I was listening to the radio and I heard them talking about an interesting topic, which was a survey of careers where the people with those jobs were ranking their overall happiness, how meaningful the work was, and then the stress load. And I just tried to see if I can find a source for the information before recording here. And this is something that perhaps you can link to in the show notes, but it's something from the Washington Post is where I found it here, called the happiest jobs on earth. And you have all these various little sliders, and you can change the order of them and rank these different careers based on happiness, meaning, stress, and one way or the other. And so the happiest of all of them was agriculture, logging, and forestry.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. The most meaningful was agriculture, logging, and forestry.
Yeah, I see that. I'm on the Washington Post right now, looking at it.
And then the least stress, agriculture, logging, and forestry. And then, so it's really fascinating. And also, if you kind of go down the list of the ones ranked by happiness, the next one down is real estate, rental, and leasing, which I could see that as being not as much of a day-to-day grind in some ways, especially if it's like rentals and stuff like that.
Yeah, that one's a little weird though.
Yeah. Construction is the third rated, which I can definitely see that. And the reason I was mentioning construction is that we're talking about in the past of, when you do something physical and you have something to show for it at the end of the day.
Yeah, the tangibility aspect of it, for sure.
And then when you combine that with the outdoors, and then you start having, the logging, agriculture, and then being in the outdoor environment, I can definitely see why, if a person is doing those sort of things where you're producing something, you're doing something physical, but you are out in nature, even though you may technically be destroying it, but you're out in nature and you could admire it before you chop down all those beautiful trees. But I found it really fascinating because it does echo a lot of some of the things we're talking about. And at the very bottom of the list of happiness is finance and insurance.
Yeah.
Arts and entertainment is kind of in the middle, a little bit higher. It's kind of the mid-higher range. But it's a lot of the stuff as you get down towards the bottom is like financial stuff, service industry. There's kind of retails in the middle. But yeah, I found that to be very, very fascinating. And then the most stressful was also finance and insurance.
And number 2 was educational services. So that's fun.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I actually find that interesting though, because so educational services is they're rating everything on a scale of what looks to be 6. Okay, 6.
Yeah.
Happiness for that is 3.9. Meaning is 4.7, so that's pretty high. But then stress is 2.9, which is one of the highest for stress out of the list that they have here. Which I could see, because you're any time that you're dealing with the public, anytime that you're dealing with not only your students, the kids, but also their parents and all of their relationships in between, I could see that. But
yeah, and I could see how the motivation behind it, the meaning behind it is all positive. But then the realities of it is where perhaps the stress comes in more in dealing with the sort of the interpersonal conflict of, working in a workplace with a bunch of other people and being sort of pushed to do different things based on the requirements versus the actual act of teaching when they're kind of in their own zone. I can see how that can be very meaningful and lead to a lot of happiness. But yeah, it's the financial people. Not very happy. Maybe not a lot of meaning, a lot of stress.
Like I said, I totally understand the agricultural logging and forestry. Just because you're out in nature, you're more connected to that.
Yeah.
So it makes sense for your scores to be so high, and obviously for your stress. I'm working on an article, and as part of this, I'd read a book from Peter Wolleben, The Secret Life of Trees, I think is the title.
Mm-hmm.
And it was talking about how we react to the different scents and different stuff that the trees emit while in various forests. So I know that it's when you're in... let me actually see if I can find these notes quick so I don't butcher this.
I'm very curious about that because it's definitely the sort of thing where if I'm walking into a forest area, when you first start taking everything in, it does change your state of mind. And it's actually interesting. It'll be interesting to hear about the different scents and how it reacts, because I definitely notice a difference between walking into a maple grove versus a pine forest. It's hard to kind of put my mind around it. Eucalyptus is another big one. They're very aromatic.
Here we go. So it's The Hidden Life of Trees, and I'll put a link down below. And he says that specifically regarding like blood pressure of forest visitors, So it rises when you're under conifers, whereas it calms down and falls in stands of oaks. So I wonder if that would play a role, if they would actually go, if the Washington Post or whoever actually organized the study would go into this agricultural, logging, and forestry industry and actually take a look at the happiness, meaning, and stress specifically scales of the people in, say, one forest versus another, a conifer forest versus an oak forest, and see how that changes things.
And thinking about that, I'm just sort of I'm picturing myself walking into either of them, and I'm going to set aside the redwoods because that's, I think, a different scenario. But if I'm hiking on a trail, and if I'm hiking through more of a, like, pine trees and such, oftentimes visibility, because they grow very dense, visibility is oftentimes diminished. And so I'm thinking just from a visual standpoint, which then starts to kind of like what kind of monsters are creeping in these woods, kind of a feeling,
Yeah.
Versus like oaks, when you have these, especially some of these large old growth oaks with these horizontal beams that stretch out long distances, you usually have a very clear forest floor below them, at least here in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see quite a bit, but you have the benefit of having the canopy overhead, so where you feel like you're enclosed in a very safe place, and also the horizontal limbs on these trees that just span out these huge distances. There's something, I think, about having horizontal versus vertical that plays a different role in how we perceive things, and which is one of the reasons why I definitely prefer horizontal compositions to vertical, because it's more calming. And this doesn't even take the sense into mind. And the reason I said I'm going to set aside redwoods for now is that redwoods are so massive that you have a very good line of sight because they're just towering high above you. And the most calm, and I would feel like the least, like the lowest blood pressure of any forest in terms of it inducing it would be the redwoods. But also because it's so very calm, so very quiet. And you feel like you're transported to a different time. But that's fascinating. I had not thought about the difference between being in either of those type of forests.
Yeah, I've always felt it. Like there's a forest that I know I've only been to a couple times, but the first time that I was there, it was a winter day, and there's soft flurries going around, and the entire time I was not as comfortable as I would like to be when I'm in the woods. And that was because it was much darker. It was a coniferous forest. It's so, like you were saying, that darkness around you, what kind of monsters are lurking around the corner kind of thing. You don't have that same degree of visibility as when you're in more of like a deciduous forest or like an oak stand or any of that, where you can see a lot more. It's a lot like brighter in that forest. And I also thought it was interesting regarding temperature. Where did that one go? Okay, so here we go. There's a difference between deciduous forest and coniferous forests when it comes to temperature as well. So he writes, on an extremely hot August day that chased the thermometer up to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, the floor of the deciduous forest was up to 50 degrees cooler than that of the coniferous, which was only a couple miles away.
Which also matches some assumptions that I have based on that, in terms of, you walk into a forest of deciduous trees, and it does often feel like a nice break from the heat, versus the pine trees. And I'm sure it has something to do with the type of shade, the water levels that are emitted into the air from the deciduous trees and all kinds of stuff along those lines.
Yeah.
And actually, on the previous account as well as talking about,
Give me
when
1
I was
second
talking
here,
about the trees.
Yeah, give me 1 second here.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Now my dog decided to come upstairs because she's afraid of the vacuum cleaner. And not a big deal until we're half an hour into this, and
Yeah.
all I hear in the background is her like throwing up. I'm like,
Oh.
great. I'm like, come on. Like, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
The only time that she comes up here is when she's afraid of the vacuum cleaner or some like loud noise downstairs. And she comes up and I'm like, just be quiet, lay in my room, just give me an hour. Like,
I was like, I'm gonna act like a cat now. Yeah.
Yeah, really. Anyway, as you were saying.
Yeah. The other thing about the trees I was thinking about, which also maybe could be a little bit more resulting in an increase of blood pressures, is when you're in the pine forest, all the trees kind of look the same.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's like this repetition of everything basically looking the same, versus if you are in a forest with deciduous trees. Each tree is a little bit different, and so I feel like having a little bit less repetition, maybe also in the back of your mind, you have a bit more like landmarks to work with in terms of, navigating through those areas. Plus, just something about like it can be a little creepy sometimes if you're somewhere and you're just surrounded by things that are all exactly the same. So that could also be a little bit offsetting or off-putting as well.
Now, the other thing that I will add here, and then we can move on if you'd like from talking about happy little trees. So the air in specifically young pine forests is almost germ-free.
Oh.
It's thanks to the phytonicides that are released by the needles. So in essence, then trees are helping to disinfect their surroundings. So if we have any germaphobes that are listening, go into a young pine forest and you'll be happy.
That's very interesting. I wonder how it is that they act upon the any sort of germs and stuff in the air. I wonder what the actual physical process by which it happens. But that's very fascinating. I would have never guessed that.
Okay, one more, because I'm actually looking through my notes now and have a bunch of these written down that are just... So, forest air is the epitome of healthy air because these trees act as huge air filters. Per year and square mile, it can amount to almost 20,000 tons of material that they filter. Okay, now I'm done.
Wow, that's truly fascinating. I mean, and I think it also just kind of confirms the things that we are somewhat aware of but can't quite put our finger on. Like, these things make sense.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating to hear those facts about them.
Yeah, so. It all goes back to that idea of learning more about your surroundings. And I think for anyone who, even if you don't go into the forest regularly, to read through this book, because it is absolutely fascinating to learn all of this stuff and to realize how helpful the forest is, not just for giving us oxygen and life, but for giving us the mental solitude and just enjoyment and all that it does for us in that aspect too.
Do you think that you'll ever do you think you'll ever, I know it's a long ways for you, but ever visit the redwoods?
I plan on it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I plan on it.
I think you'd just be absolutely blown away by it. It's just so incredible how absolutely quiet it is there. And just it's absolutely amazing. So that has been the the most impressive forest environment that I've been in, especially since they get so much rain and fog up there that everything comes alive with the water drops, hitting the plants around you on the ground and all the smells in the air. So definitely worth a visit. Very frustrating to photograph, very hard to photograph, but
that's every forest.
Yeah, just absolutely jaw-droppingly amazing. And also when you consider how old the trees are and everything that they've lived through. So I very much highly recommend it if you ever make your way out to the West Coast, because it's absolutely beautiful.
One thing that I'd love to do is essentially spend a month just traveling from a month or a month and a half traveling from Pennsylvania out to the West Coast and just spend all of that time along the West Coast. It still wouldn't be nearly enough, but
it'll give you a good sort of cursory overview, which is a very good way to do it, because that way you learn which areas you really want to spend more time at.
Yeah.
And how much time is really good to spend there as far as return trips.
I mean, the nice thing is that I already have my subject matter pretty nailed down. So yeah, I could maybe spend a day or two in Death Valley, but it's not going to be an area that I'm going to be nearly as fulfilled in as I would be in the Redwoods.
Though, so have you ever been to a true desert?
No.
See, the deserts are an area that obviously speak to me a lot, which is one of the reasons why I return to them. A place like Death Valley gives the same sort of sense of still and of calm as being in the Redwoods.
I could see that.
In a bit of a different way. But you might be surprised, and it'd actually be fascinating if, when you do go on a trip off to the West Coast, to experience the deserts and see how that makes you feel. It would be obviously a radically different sort of subject than you're used to if you were, even trying to photograph it versus just taking it all in. But it's really hard to quantify how an environment like that can be so meaningful when there's, to a person who's not as accustomed to it, they're like, it's just a desert. It's the lack of things versus being full of things. But there's something about the expansive spaces that does give me a very similar feeling to being in the Redwoods. So it would be really fascinating to see what your reaction would be to that, because it could be a bit different than you're thinking.
I wonder if that has to do with you're going from one extreme to the next. So in the Redwoods or in any forest, you're very confined, and you have that kind of that solitude and the calmness that you get almost like when someone gives you a hug.
Yeah. That's actually a very good description about it. It's like the forest is giving you a big hug.
Right. Yeah. But whereas you go into even into a field, an open field, or to expand that even further into the desert, where it's just so grandiose that you can't quantify it, and that kind of gives you a sense of calm as well. If you're looking up at the night sky kind of thing of, I'm never going to be able to realize just how big this actually is. And it kind of, in a sense, calms you in the weirdest of ways.
Yeah, that's very true. And also going back to what I was talking about earlier versus horizontal versus vertical, comparing, looking up at these strong verticals of the Redwoods, where they're kind of spaced apart, far apart from each other, it triggers something in the brain that's much different than if you're in a more condensed pine forest with all these repeating trunks that kind of almost freaks the brain out a little bit. But compare that to the desert, where you have these really strong horizontal emphasis with all the various layers.
Yeah.
And some of the canyons, when you get back into some of the canyons in places like Death Valley, they give that same sort of all-encompassing feel, kind of like in this case, these sharp, jagged rocks want to give you a hug, which sounds a bit more nightmarish, but you kind of get surrounded by the landscape in a similar way. But one of the things I do love about the desert, and this is something that I'm sure you will appreciate, is that pretty much all of it you can explore very easily on foot. Not that you're going to explore the entire desert everywhere in the world on foot, but if you see something of interest, you can go there, you can get to it, and you don't have to worry necessarily about destroying plants and animals and everything else along the way, or creating trails that will lead to, the destruction of the environment and erosion and stuff. It's, there's certain things you certainly aren't going to step on. You don't want to kill the little plants and stuff. But if you see something interesting, you can get there without fear of damaging where you are, because your footprints will get blown away and then there's no trace of you anymore, which is another thing about the desert, where especially there's these times when I'm like walking along the dunes and then it's windy and the wind is like erasing my footprints right as I walk.
Like,
so it's kind of like it's saying like, yeah, you mean nothing here.
Yeah.
which is interesting. It's humbling. I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com. And you can find my work at benhorn.com. For further discussion, join us at patreon.com/creativebanter. It's a place where we can interact with you, the listener. And although we greatly appreciate those who contribute by joining a tier, discussions are open to everyone, whether you're a paying member or not. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.